tensions and clashes in East Jerusalem for a whole range of causes and issues there. Things have been particularly bad in the West Bank, where the situation seems to be getting worse by the day. Just yesterday, we saw 5 Palestinians killed in the northern city of Jenin. In response, Palestinians have mobilized mass protests and a general strike in a number of West Bank cities, including Ramallah, Hebron, Nablus, Qalqilia, and Tulkarem. The situation is so bad, actually, that one Western diplomat I spoke with described the situation as something like the Second Intifada, but without Israeli casualties. There are, of course, major differences between what is happening now and what took place 20 years ago, which we will discuss here in our event. There is also, I think, a tendency, especially here in Washington, to treat events in Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank in isolation of one another, when in fact they are all interconnected and in a very organic way. And that's how we're going to deal with them, with these issues today. So to help us better understand these issues, we've lined up a really excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them briefly here quickly, and you can read their full bios on the event page on our website for this event. First, we have joining us virtually Suhair Freitag, who is a consultant, a former consultant for the International Crisis Group. She is usually based in the West Bank, but is currently joining us from Amman. Next, we have Brian Katulis, who is Vice President of Policy here at the Middle East Institute. Sandra Rashid, who is joining us in person, who is a Palestine Country Director for ANIRA. And also joining us virtually is from Gaza is Omar Sha'ban, founder and director of PalThink for Strategic Studies, who, as I mentioned, is joining us from Gaza. Just a few housekeeping notes. The format will be pretty straightforward, basic moderated Q&A. I'll put questions to our panelists, but we also welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We'll have our colleagues here in Washington will be screening those, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can over the course of the discussion. If you have any technical problems, you can put those in the chat box. Finally, just to note, this webinar is being recorded. So I'm going to start with Suhair from ANIRA. Suhair is someone who follows, I'm sorry, my bad. Suhair, who's joining us virtually from Amman, as someone who follows the security situation closely, tell us what's happening now on the ground, particularly in Jenin, Nablus area. How did these events begin? What is the Israeli army trying to achieve? And if you could also tell us a little bit about the Palestinian militant groups that Israel seems to be targeting. Who are they? What do they represent? Do they belong to established factions like the ones we've known for many years? Or are they some sort of new force? Give us, sort of paint the picture for us, if you could, of what's happening on the ground in the northern West Bank.
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me in this event, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you for the Middle East Institute and for the audience here. As a one who lived in West Bank, especially in the conflict, I was born in the conflict, and I know how things are going, and I follow up the situation on the ground. Telling the truth, the recent incidents is not really new. Things have been happening since 2016, since the what they name it, the stabbing intifada. It's individual intifada, and it is not something well organized, and people are doing this from from despair background. There's the impasse of peace process, no negotiations, no hope for a Palestinian independent state. And most of the people whom they are involved in this intifada were in 2016 and until now were born after 2000. Mostly they are during the peacetime. They were born during the peacetime between hyphens. So I just want to focus on this as a background of the situation here. The situation in Nablus, in Jenin, it's not only, this is maybe the hot spots in West Bank, but the despair is everywhere. And the losing hope of having a liberated state, and the Oslo project mostly collapsed. So people has nothing to do. The Palestinian Authority is in shortage of finance and there's no job opportunities. The unemployment rate rising, the toll of unemployment is rising. So there are no hopes in Palestine. So you can find these kids, and I always say about the what we say, the fighters, that they are kids, they are not really fighters. So the situation is not really comfortable in West Bank, especially in Jenin, after the arresting of the leader of Jihad al-Islami, Bassam Saadi. It was like a red line for the people there. So the incidents even before Bassam Saadi, but increased after the arresting of the leader of the Jihad Islami. So this is in Jenin. In Nablus, the same situation, where like the Al-Aqsa brigades were like a group of teenagers, and they were like fighters. They were like going to attack the settlers who attend the Joseph tomb as a fighting, but it was not a real fighting. And Israel is always like to consider these kids as terrorists, and they want to just to crack down and put the law and order in West Bank, complaining the Palestinian security services that they are not doing their job. So they want to take over what's the security, what the Palestinian security did not do. So it's like a complaining game between the two sides. Who is the one who can force or impose the authority on the ground? So these the military militants in West Bank, they are mostly kids born in 2000 and even, and they have no hope. They are individual, and they are not from a faction like what it's like published in the media, but they carry guns. I don't know from where they bring these guns. It's a huge amount of guns in the camps, and nobody knows from where they bring these rifles and weapons, especially these teenagers who are holding these rifles and fighting without any kind of mobilization or discipline or training, and they just take it on their shoulder. So things are like not really serious, not a real war, but it's like a kind of clashes. And the kids who are in the camps or in the old city of Nablus, they say just, we want to fight. We are not going to surrender for people whom, like soldiers, whom they are the most strong army in the Middle East, which is the Israeli army. So they have like a kind of retaliation and revenge with these Israeli soldiers. For example, when the Israeli army entered the Jenin camp, they just want a guy from there, a wanted guy. But when they leave with like another 20 who are in a retaliation feelings that they want to take revenge from what had happened that night or in that day in the camp. So things are like a cycle of revenge with the people there.
So the Israeli army goes in to ostensibly to quell or calm the situation and end up actually escalating matters.
Yes, that's right. That's what that's
so. Thank you, Suhair. I want to turn to Omar in Gaza. Omar, how do these events in the West Bank relate to the situation in Gaza? You recently wrote a piece for us here at MEI in which you say that Israel's latest offensive against Islamic Jihad just a few weeks ago was ultimately aimed, among other things, at delinking Gaza, ensuring that Gaza remains disconnected from the West Bank. Could you break that down for us? And what is the purpose in this Israeli strategy? How successful is it? And what has been the response in Gaza to events unfolding in the West Bank, both at the level of the authorities, but also ordinary Palestinians?
Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Khalid, again for hosting me to this event, and thank to the Middle East Institute for keeping discussing the hot issues on time. I will make myself short as usual, and I can say first point, Israel did not succeed to fragment the Palestinian people. Palestinian Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, they feel that they are Palestinian. Yes, indeed, in the latest escalation, Israel succeeded to separate between Islamic Jihad and Hamas, but not because Israel wanted to do that, because Hamas didn't want to take Gaza for a war for an objective or a purpose that is not a matter of consensus, what's arrestation of one person. Yes, that at that time, the 3 days, the 55 hours war from Israel and Islamic Jihad was not justified, not only by Hamas, but by the people themselves. I can tell you now, we are in Gaza, we are very worried, everything is monitored, and if things in Jerusalem getting worse, I'm very scared that things will go and deteriorate. You remember in May, when also in May 2021, the 11 days war did not lead to big war, which also I wrote a piece to Middle East Institute at that time. But any attacks against Jerusalem or settlers come to Jerusalem, it wouldn't maintain the situation calm, and it will make difficult for Hamas to stay calm and to not to go for escalation like the previous war in 2021. There are some mediation, intensive mediation now to calm things here and there. That's why the things in Jerusalem are not as hot as it's supposed to be, I think, but nobody can guarantee the situation will continue to be calm. In brief, Gaza is connected. It will be difficult for Hamas to keep silent as like last time if things getting worse in Jerusalem. Already, the Gaza sky is full by the Israeli drone. There are some military preparation here. There's some alert among the military group in Gaza. We are very afraid that things will get worse. That's why the international community need to understand the 2021 war might happen again in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Sandra, I want to turn to you now. Your organization does humanitarian work, ANIRA. As someone who works regularly with Palestinian communities in the West Bank, in Gaza, and also in Jerusalem, how do you see the latest developments? Specifically, how are they affecting the humanitarian conditions on the ground in all of these areas? Do you see any trends that are particularly troubling? For example, are are things getting demonstrably worse, or is this sort of a very bad episode that will eventually pass?
Thank you, Khaled, and thank you for allowing us to be here today with all of you in our great panel online. I think Suhair said it really well. She said that this is not something new. This is something that's been happening since 2016. I say that it's been happening since 1988, since the first intifada. We've been going through different intifadas. And the situation now, as anyone who follows the situation in Palestine and Palestine-Israel, ebbs and flows. We have ups and downs, high periods of conflict. It can cool down, and then we're definitely at the very high peak of escalation of violence against the Palestinian people. And again, going back to what was said earlier, there is quite a bit of despair and a lot of losing hope, because the humanitarian situation in Palestine is quite dire. If you look at Gaza alone, they're working with 12 hours of rolling electricity. So they might have electricity for 4 hours, cut off for 4 hours, along with the rising food insecurity, the increased unemployment rate. Those lead to more feelings of despair and hopelessness. And we see that our youth are not only disillusioned, but frustrated from all ends. And frustrated not just from the PNA, the de facto in Israel, but frustrated from anybody who's not doing anything to alleviate this situation. So the humanitarian situation, along with what my two previous colleagues described, is adding to the intense situation that Palestinians are living in. This is definitely a high period where things are very, very dire and very intense. Both alluded to things getting worse. I've heard similar things, Ahmad, in terms of another attack on Gaza and escalation that could be happening from now until December. So people are on guard. They're frustrated. They're worried about what might happen, along with everything that's happening, as you mentioned, in these hot spots in Jenin, in Nablus and Hebron. It makes doing humanitarian work very difficult. So for ANERA, we are working under a difficult situation, but now with these more intensified violence against Palestinians in these various communities, and it limits our access to reach these communities. It limits our ability to do the work, the humanitarian development work that we do so well in these areas. So it is definitely something that we're looking at, and I believe what the youth and the Palestinians and everybody wants is people to be able to intervene in one way or another. So this is what we're, as Palestinians in the communities, what we're hoping to see is that we do go back to some kind of negotiations, but under the current circumstances, that's not where we're headed.
And just to clarify, just overall, do you see the situation since, let's say, the mid 2010s, right? Since 2015, 16, is it generally in decline? Is it deteriorating? Or is it, as you said, ebbing and flowing? Are the trend lines steadily moving this way, or are they just up and down?
The trend lines,
humanitarian sense.
In the humanitarian sense, they're definitely declining. They're
Okay.
definitely declining in terms of, going back to even, from the signing of the Oslo Accords and the hope that was built on those, on that process.
Almost 30 years ago.
Almost 30 years ago, but what has changed? That hope for economic development, the hope for development in the private sector, in the social spheres. There was a lot of hope there, and that has all declined. It's gotten much worse, and nobody has that hope. It's, again, as was said, there's a lot of despair that's happening.
Thank you. Brian, I want to bring you into this conversation. You have been around this issue for many years, on again, off again. You just returned from a trip to Israel and Palestine, where you had a range of meetings with the Israelis and Palestinians. So tell us, how do you see the situation? How did you see it while you were there, and how do you see things now, both on the ground as well as in terms of the broader political environment? Specifically, what do you think the mood is politically among Palestinians at this particular moment.
Great. Thanks, Khaled, and thanks to all the panelists, and also thanks to Anira and Sandra for joining us. Our friend Sean Carroll leads Anira, which is a tremendous organization that's worked for decades helping the Palestinian people. And they have their gala here this week on Friday night. So for those of you inclined to support a group that is just doing good work, helping people with water, sanitation, just the basics in Palestine and Lebanon and other places, check them out, support them. They're doing really good work to help people and do the basics there. To answer your question, Khaled, I think every single panelist so far has used the same phrase, no hope. And I used to live there in the 1990s, have traveled there regularly. You and I worked together on a project during the first Palestinian elections in 1996, where there was, I think, some sense of hope, in part, even though it was constrained by many different factors, in part because people felt like they had a voice in things. That was 1996. There have been subsequent elections and opportunities through formal politics to lift up their voice, but it's been more than, what, 15 years or so, almost coming up on 20, since there was a nationwide election. So what I would say is the top line is that there is, my impression is the mood there was quite like what I think our friends in Florida maybe experienced earlier this week when they saw these dark clouds rising and about to come, and a real storm, unfortunately, in the security and basic human security situation, but also the political situation. And I think the Palestinians are experiencing a political legitimacy crisis that's unprecedented. This has been said before, but I think it's, when you look at the public opinion polls and you match that up with the conversations I had in my last visit, again, with officials, with ordinary people, with friends that we worked with on these programs for democracy back in the 1990s. And there's just a deep sense that the structures that were created back in the 1990s really aren't performing, but more importantly, they aren't reflecting the concerns of ordinary Palestinians. And this is a dysfunction within the political system that I think is echoed next door in Israel, where there's, the incapacity of the system to actually bring people together, to build coalitions. There just is no politics right now. And when I asked people who are in the circles of power what their plan was, and here I didn't make it into Gaza, I'm talking mostly in Ramallah, and people who are in the PLO and PA structures. And what it seems like their game plan is they're hoping for some sort of stage managed transition. There's a recognition that when President Abbas leaves the scene, he's one of the last national symbols, like Yasser Arafat was, that had broad credibility in their assessment, broad legitimacy to sit in several different positions. So their formula seems to me to be one of trying to divvy up seats and do it not in a way that gives voice to the Palestinian people. And that to me seems short-sighted. It ignores this reality that's unfolding with a new generation of Palestinians that the previous panelists talked about. There is just a basic impulse that I think it should not be ignored, which is that people want to have a voice in their own affairs. They want to have politics. It seems so basic, but that's not what I heard from Palestinian officials. There is a concern about the meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So the real question, though, is then, given the unfolding dynamics, especially in the West Bank, and given what Omar said, that these things are interlinked, as much as people would like to segment Gaza from the West Bank to Jerusalem, it's not happening, and they're very much interlinked. So I think a wiser course would be, and I'm not calling for elections right now, I don't know how you get from here to there, but to open up the space for more people, and especially the younger generation, to express their views about how they want to live their lives. There needs to be a political horizon. And right now, the no hope is related to that. And the last thing I'd say, in talking to, again, officials, but then analysts, people we've known for decades and worked together on programs like this, when I said, well, what about these ideas that we in think tanks in DC like to talk about, like a one state or a confederation and two state? And again, this is anecdotal. there's other polling on these questions. They say this is irrelevant to our lives right now. The fundamental is that you've got a group of people who don't feel represented in their own systems of power. And that is going to change because faces will change. People will depart from the scene. Whether it's going to be a smooth transition or one that looks quite rocky remains to be seen. But the conditions, I would say, to close on this, don't look really good. It looks like, the word fauda was used quite a lot in my meetings, that there's chaos coming. And there are things I think could be done by Palestinians themselves, certainly Israelis too, to help improve the situation and prepare for a transition. And also we'll get to US policy, what could be done.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, this is an issue that really gets short shrift, especially here in Washington. The idea that, sure, a peace process would be nice between Israelis and Palestinians, but people overlook the fact that if Palestinians don't have effective governance and effective political leadership, you can never even get to that stage. So Suhaid, I want to come back to you, staying with this theme of Palestinian leadership. We've seen condemnations of the Israeli assault that's happening in the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority. We've also seen PA security forces carrying out their own violent raids in some of these same places in the northern West Bank, including actions that have led to the deaths of other Palestinians, as well as arrests. So what has been the PA, the Palestinian Authority's role so far in this, and how is it being seen by ordinary Palestinians? All of this is happening in the midst of things like reconciliation talks in far-off Algiers. How relevant is that process to this idea of putting the Palestinian polity kind of back together? And is that doable?
Well,
that's a lot, I know.
That's a lot. That's a lot, yes. Well, let's talk about the Palestinian Authority. It's an interim entity toward the Palestinian state, and people were very optimistic about having a state. That was in the 90s, and in the second Intifada, things like getting down then. But after electing Abu Mazen in 2005 and things like getting more optimistic again, having a new system between developing economic and making the security reforms. Even in that time in 2007, when there was the reforms were on the ground and changing things, making the crackdown in Nablus and in Jenin, and even Jenin used to be always a hard place to enter for the security, for the Palestinian security services. I mean, even in the old city of Nablus, the Al-Aqsa brigades and the other brigades were hard to be controlled. But even though people of the community, the normal Palestinians, the ordinary Palestinians were supporting the security services in that time, and they even convinced many of the who were wanted to surrender their weapons for the security services, and the benefit of having reforms and having a new era toward peace and having peace in that time. But later on, when things were no negotiations on the table, no talks, and on the ground, the settlements expanding, the land confiscations were even increasing. Things are getting deteriorating more and more, and Israel is acting as if it's the only power in West Bank, even ignoring sometimes or even all the times that there are security services from the Palestinian side and there's a Palestinian Authority. This is weakening the Palestinian Authority. People, whatever the Palestinian Authority tried to make, the security services, especially the security, consider it as a traitors. They are traitors. They are collaborators. They are trying to force us to to be slaves for the occupation. This is the word which always say, we are not abid, which is we are not slaves. And the Palestinian Authority always try to make like a compromise between not to make the people angry from it all the time, but like try to hold the stick from the middle. But it couldn't be, because either you are with your people or you are with the occupation. So people start to look at the Palestinian Authority of whatever they condemning the Israeli assaults or the Israeli incursions as if it's like just like tricks, or they are going from behind, but they don't believe it. So looking at the mirror of the Palestinian Authority, they just see the Israelis. They don't see the national forces or those whom they are just want to control the security in West Bank on their way to build the Palestinian state. The hopeless case here is people are really losing hope. This is the problem here. And we have to bring hope to people, to the young generations. So there's a kind of mistrust, and people are not really, don't believe what the security services are doing. It's not for their benefit, it's only for the benefit of Israel. So they do not trust whatever the security services do and on the ground. So whatever, when in the recent incidents in Al Jalami, two from the security services who were killed in an attempt of operations and killing an Israeli soldier, people were like talking on the ground that they were sure they were not from the security, that it's just individual, because they have no trust, and they lose hope from the security to protect them. They only say that it protects only the Israelis, the Israeli army and the settlers. So this is the problem, that there is no trust between the two sides, from the people of West Bank and the security services. And I know many of the security members whom they feel very very painful to be branded as traitors or collaborators. But this is the situation now on the ground.
Thank you, Suhair. Omar, I want to ask you the same basic question, but maybe with a slight twist. You know, I think it's obvious that a lot of the Palestinian Authority's shortcomings are indigenous, right? They're self-inflicted. These are internal Palestinian issues, but a lot of it also is structural. It's built into the Oslo process that the PA's primary responsibility from a security standpoint is to prevent terrorist attacks and disarm militants and so forth. And just given that and the obvious power asymmetry, is there a way around this constant tension that exists between a Palestinian Authority that is, in the eyes of its people, supposed to meet its needs, protect them, but that in reality has a different set of responsibilities, and ultimately based on the fact that it receives so much aid from the outside world and operates at Israel's discretion? Is it possible for the PA to not be seen as collaborators and to effectively represent and meet the needs of Palestinians, and at the same time satisfy the Israelis and the Americans?
Thank you, Khaled, for this couple of the questions. I will try to answer them. Yes, of course, there is something in between. The Palestinian Authority is seen by the majority of Gaza as they don't deliver the basic needs for the Gaza. If you look at how many Palestinians from Gaza was employed by the PA, almost zero. They talk about their early retirement. It's targeted Gaza. How many Palestinians from Gaza was recruited in the diplomatic sector in Palestine? Almost zero. How many scholarship? There was 2 weeks ago about scholarship in Algiers where Gaza good students were declined. in addition to many other behavior like patient cancer. Some kids from Gaza who sent to Ramallah and Nablus, they are declined from giving the NF treatment because there is no financial coverage. BA in Gaza is not very visible, even sometimes worse. Just this week, I run a think tank in Gaza, small think tank, of course. We have a new regulation by the Palestinian Authority imposing the NGOs that make our life more difficult. So Israel has closed 6 NGOs in Ramallah 2 months ago. Now we have a new law by the Palestinian Authority, make very restricted sponsorship and process on the NGOs. So if we receive a grant from the US, for example, into Gaza, $10,000, it will take us 3 months to get all the approval. So it makes our life very difficult. And then we cannot deliver good services to our young people. Yesterday, I hosted some AU people came from Jerusalem. They talked to 60 young people from Gaza who have never been outside. 62% of the Gazans are under 30. 2 million people. Gaza is increasing by 60,000 newborn every year. As I said before, 900,000 people from Gaza were born under siege, and another 900,000 become adult under siege. In 10 years' time, I say this to you and to the Israelis, need to understand that the whole society will be a collective siege mentality society. 2.5 million will be all of them either born or grown in a cell, in a prison. So which kind of education, which kind of people will be there? Yes, BA has a lot of things to deliver in Gaza. I will tell you something. Last week, we were invited by the Gaza Authority at a civil society, very small people, very small group of civil society, high level from the leadership. They talked to us for 3 hours about what they want to do, what about Algeria. So they exchange. It has never happened with the BA. We never receive a phone call from the BA, Omar, come to Ramallah. I go to Ramallah, but there is no structure, there is no regular meeting between this and this. Of course, the situation in Gaza is not totally different, but a lot of different. Yesterday, there is a statistic by the Palestinian Statistical Bureau. The GDP per capita in West Bank, 3 times double from the Gaza. In Gaza, $300 something. In West Bank is $1,200. Number of employment is extremely high. Number of divorce, extremely high. Water is totally bad. Electricity, I have solar energy in my home, otherwise I will not be able to talk with you. There is no hope. Now, if you ask what is the solution, it's about election. I talked with Hamas last week. I was a workshop organized by Palestine and another NGOs, attended by 100 people, about why not to make election in Gaza to complement the municipal election. My blame goes to the American administration who came to Palestine and they maintain the status quo. Election is the entry point. Our right, our situation in the West Bank is totally bad and it will trigger a war. If it's not today, maybe next week. I want to close by this. I am surprised by people who are surprised. We should not be surprised. We have talked about this couple of times before. We will meet in 2023 to talk about another war because the situation is very fragile. Even the calmness that we see now in Gaza between Hamas and Israel through some economic facilitation here and there is not enough at all. We need to give people hope. As I said, 2/3 of Gaza population have never given the right to cast their votes in any election. So it's not about food. Yes, people are very poor, people are starving, but more important, people have no hope because they are not part of any process, neither by the Gaza Authority nor by the Palestinian Authority. Election, change the leadership, give people hope, change the structure, bring people into the political system. Last election or last time where the election was supposed to happen on the 22nd of May 2021 and it was cancelled or postponed by President Abbas 1 week before, 36 candidates list, Khalid. 36 candidate list were present their candidacy. 20 of them from among young people who don't see the political faction currently represent them. So there is a new group of among Palestinians, not only in Gaza and West Bank, who are very interested and seeking an exchange of the leadership. So what is the question? What is the solution for this? Election, and of course, reconciliation. Thank you.
Thanks, Omar. You mentioned the 6 Palestinian NGOs, or 7 actually, that were shut down by Israel. I want to ask you, Sandra, in sort of broader terms, what kind of challenges do humanitarian and other civil society groups like your own face in delivering the kinds of services that you do or the work that you do in different parts of Palestine? And how did those challenges differ from one place to another? Obviously, the challenges in Gaza are not identical to Jerusalem, or not identical to the West Bank. And how do you deal with those very different kinds of environments?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Khaled. I'm going to start off by addressing that last point that you made, that each challenge in each area is different. Palestine is very small. When we're looking at Palestine in terms of land, it's a very small area. However, you have Gaza, you have the West Bank, you have East Jerusalem, that all have very different challenges, different obstacles. We're dealing with 3 different governments. Palestine is dealing basically with 3 different governments. We deal with the government of Israel, we deal with the PNA, and we deal with the de facto in Gaza. And each of these different governments and each of the different challenges that face the communities that we serve really make the way that we approach development or humanitarian work very different in terms of how we want to do our programming. So, for example, in Jerusalem, when most of the work is governed by the government of Israel, it's very difficult to look at how we can address the education challenges. We can't build new classrooms because to get a building permit is very, very difficult. So you have classrooms that are overcrowded. You have classrooms that are not equipped to deal with the challenges that the students face. Students, unfortunately, when they're going to school themselves, have to deal with crossing different, I wouldn't say checkpoints, but different areas where there are soldiers, and a lot of the times, if it's not soldiers, it's border police or the police that are regulating their movements. That is different than the West Bank when you look at the issue of settlements and military close proximity to military bases, where children, for example, in Hebron, are attacked almost daily by Israeli settlers, and Palestinians have to try to see how they can again go about their lives, whether it's education, whether it's seeking healthcare, whether it's looking for economic opportunities in a very tense situation. And when we look at economic development in Hebron, for example, we have to take these into account. How can we do economic programming when our communities are in close proximity to settlements or that they are under attack? How can we work with children in building kindergartens when the resources that are needed are difficult to bring in? And in Gaza, as Omar has said, we're dealing with a 16-year blockade, and we can't. Most of our staff find it difficult to even go to Gaza, and our staff that are in Gaza find it difficult to come out of Gaza. So there's the work that we do is very limited to the very area where our staff are located. And this is something that is true to all organizations. I believe the 7 organizations that you mentioned is also important because there's a shrinking space. There's a shrinking civil society space in terms of how we can work, how we can advocate, how we can deliver when the means to do that are continually shrinking, and we're continually looking at how we can work within these 3 governments that I mentioned in the beginning. So I believe, going back to something that was asked earlier, is it more tense? Is it more difficult? Even delivering work such as the work that INERA is doing and has been doing for 55 years is more difficult, is more challenging. And unfortunately, we are not able to deliver the level of interventions that we would like to do because of these restrictions.
Right. Thank you. Brian, I want to come back to you. I want to zoom out a little bit in terms of the political environment and ask you about Israeli politics. As everyone knows, Israel is headed toward yet another election in just a few weeks, I think November 1st. Some people have suggested that maybe the election cycle might be partly responsible for this campaign, that it's kind of posturing. We saw yesterday, I think Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh released a statement pretty much saying that, condemning Israel and accusing Israeli leaders of using Palestinian blood as a ticket in the upcoming Israeli elections. Do you see a connection between this election campaign happening in Israel, the latest and this latest crackdown? And more broadly, what role does Israeli politics and the current political configuration and in some ways dysfunction, how does that impact realities on the ground or feed into these dynamics?
So just the headline is, I think Palestine is out of sight, out of mind, mostly in Israeli politics today. I think the operations and the campaigns you're talking about, I do think we need to recognize that some of this is born out of a genuine sense of insecurity and a threat that Israel sees and perceives and has experienced, right? And as you said in your comments and other panelists have, that the way they go about it and when they go in and conduct these operations, it causes more problems and stirs up and cause, it's sort of it's not a new story. We've seen this before. The reason why I say I don't think it's driven by Israeli politics, I'd be skeptical of what Mohammed, and his statement is a political statement as well. He's one of the 3 or 4 figures that's hoping to stay in his seat or have a promotion, if you will. And it goes back to an earlier point I was trying to make and wrote a longer article earlier this week about this, is that when your life is so constrained, when you don't have control over your own affairs, your politics become the politics of the struggle and the resistance, right? So that's how I evaluate Shtayyeh's remarks. And I say that because when you look at the tenor of the Israeli election campaign so far, this is their 5th election in 3 years. So if the Palestinian situation is one where people are sick and tired of the same faces that they've had as leaders, whether it's in Gaza or in the West Bank, in Israel, they're sick and tired of voting. I didn't meet anyone who seemed happy that their system was producing a 5th election in 3 years. And the best prediction from these elections, the result so far, is that they'll have a 6th election in 2023. And we'll get to US policy in a bit, but a lot of, and you've written about this before, Khaled, and others have, a lot of US policy on Palestine and towards Palestinians is so predicated on who is leading Israel and the US-Israel relationship and not the US-Palestinian relationship. So, the big issues aren't the Palestinian question. The big ones are to Bibi or not to Bibi. It's sort of like what the GOP here experiences right now, Trump or not Trump. Talked to a lot of Israeli analysts. There's no big ideas. It's become in many ways, like many other Middle Eastern countries that we've seen, deeply sectarian politics, identity politics. One that actually has become, as we've all seen, more right-wing. And what I think we're seeing in the worrisome trend in Israeli politics right now are the appearance, they've always been there, but the growing sort of voice of very extremist voices on the right and just blatantly anti-Arab. But again, I go back to my central point. I don't think these campaigns are connected to the political campaigns. I think it's about security. And the whole Palestinian question is out of sight, out of mind. Yes, Prime Minister Lapid gave a speech last week at UNGA. He voiced the words of a 2-state solution, nor did I see that as, smart politics in his own context, because it's almost like when you bring up the Palestinian question in an Israeli political context right now, it's an inconvenience. It's something that penalized. It's not even, they don't want to talk about it, right? And I think pushing the Palestinians to the margin, out of sight, out of mind, these normalization accords, I think accelerate that phenomena. But I'll close with this point, is that though I think this is the operations are security driven, and though I think the politics of Israel are depressing in their own way, many elections, but some of the same results, nothing new. I think the thing that people need to keep in mind here in the policy debate back here in Washington is that you're not going to have a stable and sustainable broader region without taking into consideration the Palestinians and how they're going to live. There's almost as if there's hope for more normalization accords, and we can just ignore this, and that's just not going to happen, right? In part because you have literally millions of people who are there, and they want a voice, and that's the central, I think, theme in a lot of our comments here, is that they want to be represented in their own politics. I think the impulse is in their own politics for the moment right now. They'd like to have a chance at a new generation and a new face to say that. Nobody's really talking about a next round of peace talks right now. It's more elemental, it's more basic. And I think that's last thing is that there's this weirdly symbiotic relationship between Israel and its politics, having blinders about what's going on in Palestine, and then the current leaders of Palestine who are sitting in their seats literally for decades. And they're there, and it's stagnant in part because these two political dynamics amongst Palestinians first and Israelis in an odd way do feed off of themselves, and I think produce this stagnancy, which is not stable in any case.
Right. It's interesting because, and I want to get into sort of where we go from here in this last round of questions that I want to put to you all, because so if you see me looking at my phone, I'm not going through my Twitter, I'm going through audience questions, and a lot of the questions are really on how do we fix this? And what's interesting to me is that so much of the discussion has focused on the internal Palestinian dysfunction as a first step. And so, Suhair, I want to ask you, as a Palestinian, as someone on the ground, as an observer of the conditions on the ground and the Palestinian politics such as they are, based on everything that you've seen and everything that we've discussed, where do you see what should be that first step? Or how do we end this? How do we bring hope to especially young Palestinians? How do we create a political horizon, not necessarily for a future negotiating summit of some sort, but or just in terms of local politics? How do we give Palestinians a say back in their own political institutions and in their own future? How much of giving hope to Palestinians is an internal remedy versus an external remedy? Things that Israel needs to do or things that the international community needs to do. How do you see the way forward?
Telling the truth, the way forward, the first thing in the internal politics in the Palestinian area, it's the elections. People were very optimistic about going to elections and trying to renew the political system in West Bank, especially in West Bank. And as Omar said, 36 elected lists were there, and people were working on elections and trying to find an exit from this impasse.
Great, thank you. So I want to ask...
sorry, it was muted.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm talking about the elections to renew the Palestinian political system. And then we will go forward in bringing hope for the new generations. For example, I want to talk about an initiative which the Palestinian youth telling that, which is actually they were really involved in. It's about peace initiative from the Palestinian grassroots toward the UN, and to create a new UNSCOP. And at the end, it will go for a referendum, and then will be as peace initiative from the Palestinian people to the Israeli people. It will be from people to people at the end, And we are really optimistic that Abu Mazen, the President Abbas, in the UN speech, he was talking about such a plan, and he asked the Secretary General to make such a plan. And in this UNSCOP, we are like more optimistic. If we can go forward, we can do something serious about it. And to go back to the question, Khaled, it's the elections about renew the political system. Things will be more relaxed for the youth, and they will have their role in the political life. And it will not be only just focus on the old guards of the Palestinian leadership.
Great, thank you. I just want to ask a quick follow-up. If things don't change, if there aren't elections, if there is no renewal in politics and fresh faces in Palestinian politics, and we just sort of continue along, do you see a possibility of a organized Palestinian rebellion, not just against the occupation, but perhaps even against their own leadership? Is that something you see in the realm of possibility if this continues indefinitely?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. People are not relaxed, are not comfortable with the performance of the leadership, because they don't see from the leaders, from their leaders, any serious actions on the ground to release their lives. And I'm talking about new generations. There are like more than 50% from the Palestinians, the population. So we are talking about youth who are without hope, youth who is like need something to need a horizon, a political horizon, economical horizon. There's no horizon at the end of the tunnel. There's no light. So when you see, like, I want to talk about friends who they are kids, but they are friends, and they don't see now Palestine as West Bank and Gaza. Now they look at Palestine from the river to the sea. I know that they will say it's really complicated, and Israel will say that, but the Palestinians don't want us here, and it's extreme. We are going to the extreme. So right. Yes, either we are intifada against Israel or intifada against the leadership, the Palestinian leadership.
Right, interesting. Omar, I want to ask you the same line of questioning about the way forward, but I'd like to sort of focus in particularly on the regional environment. What role can the region play, particularly Arab governments? We know that Egypt and Jordan are probably the two most active countries in terms of what's happening in Palestine. They're the ones who follow events most closely, and of course they have the biggest stake in the Palestinian issue. But other than that, we don't really see much from the region. In the past, Saudi Arabia was quite vocal, acting on behalf of Palestinians. There's a lot of talk that maybe countries that have normalized relations with Israel, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, maybe they could use these relationships as leverage somehow to convince the Israelis to do this or not do that. But we're not really seeing that either. Do you see a role in your sort of prescription for where things should go from here? If you could tell us in general what you think, but also on this point of the regional environment, what should Arab countries be doing to help things along, or at least give Palestinians some hope? Omar?
Me?
Hi, Omar.
Hello?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah. I hear the question very well. And I said that this is very important point. In the past 10 years, Palestinian cause become a mirror to the dispute in the Arab region. Before it was a unifying factor, now it becomes a mirror for the Arab. For example, the conflict between Algeria and Morocco, it reflected on the inside Palestinian domestic politics. The conflict between Egypt, Qatar, and other Gulf countries before removing the blockade on Qatar, it was reflected here. I'm writing not a paper, but I'm writing a presentation, and I try to put my thinking about it. And I said, respond to your question, Khalid, that it's old playground, but new players. Historically, Gaza, Egypt was big player in Gaza. Jordan was big player in West Bank, both countries, and Saudi. Now we have new players. We have Iran, we have Hezbollah, we have Syria, we have Turkey, we have Malaysia. And the role of this traditional, moderate, let's say, power like Egypt and Saudi and others, they are shrinking. And they're replaced by other factors, by other countries who are, some of them are not interested in politics and stability. The last war in August, what lasted for 55 hours, Israeli against Islamic Jihad, it was clear where the Iranian involvement or encouragement, and Nakhala, the head of Islamic Jihad, was in Tehran to do the press conference. We know this very well. And not only me, many other politicians and security people know this. So the vacuum that was created by the US and the European and by other countries was filled by some other players. So what do you expect from them? Much more. For example, for Egypt, we expect better relation with Egypt, better treatment and Rafah crossing, allowing people to go and come. We expect some better relation between Gaza and on the West Bank going to the Jordan. We expect those countries who normalize their relations with Israel. I am a person who understand. Maybe I don't like it, but I understand. But what is the benefit for Gaza from these countries? Nothing. Nothing. There is no project in Gaza or in the West Bank done by these countries. Of course, the price will be politically high, but at least they didn't try to help the situation in Palestine. They can support finance, they can support by scholarship, they can support by their presence, they can support politically, they can support through different type of cooperation. So unfortunately, I don't want to call them the bad power, but those power who are not interested in stability are more influential than the normal traditional power. In Gaza, for the past 3 years, Qatar was donating by $30 million a month, $160 a year. Part of this donation goes to electricity. This is why we have 10 to 12 hour electricity in Gaza. But the rest is not. My last point, Khalid, is many people in international community look at Gaza as a humanitarian. Only need food. This is not true. Gaza is very dynamic, and I'm using this platform to change the mentality or to change the attitude towards Gaza. Gaza is dynamic, reviving economy. We have 6,000, please pay attention. We have 6,000 talented young Gazan who develop software to the Gulf and make money, make a lot of money. There is a potential here about tourism, about software, about young people. Like the meeting that I was telling you today, where 60 young people met with some European from Sweden. It was for some young people, it was the first time ever for them in Gaza to see a white lady or a European lady. And then you can understand that culture shock. So we need to open the window to widen the option among Gazan youth by helping them, by working with them. What the Arab can do, they can do a lot in this side. If they cannot act politically, if they cannot pressure Israel, at least let's help the people to make them powerful and to strengthen them. Thank you, Khalid.
Thanks, Omar. Just a quick follow-up, if I could, on this question of the role of Arab states. Do you see part of the failing of this leadership? Obviously, there's a lot of reasons why the region isn't paying attention to Palestinians. But is part of the reason for that also a responsibility of this leadership in that they haven't kept the issue alive in Arab states in the way that, yes, Yasser Arafat in the past was very adept at using the Palestinian issue in internal Arab politics. Is that also a factor, or is this mostly just sort of bigger geopolitical things beyond the Palestinians' control?
Thank you, Khalid. Again, it's a key factor. It's a key factor. Our leadership did not give attention to the key factor, to the key hours in the Arab world. When was the last visit of our prime minister or our president to Egypt or to Tunisia or to Algeria or to I don't know where? Where is the joint bilateral relationship between the Egyptian and the Palestinian at the ministerial level? Yes, I don't want to tell you what I know, but sorry for that, but yes, it's a key factor. This is why election is a key element, not only with the Israeli-Palestinian track, but between the Arab and the Palestinian track and within the Palestinian political system. You need people, new people who have a fresh blood to do something and to look better into the future. As I said to you, 6,000 people from Gaza. This is not official number. Maybe could 10,000 young people who are very good in software, produce software even to the West Bank through online. This kind of this young people, they need more leadership or technical leadership who can help them to grow their businesses. Our leadership who were born in the 50s and the 40s, and they still continue to speak to us in the narrative of 60s and the 70s and the 80s is not going to work. So yes, the answer to your question.
Thanks, Omar. Sandra, I want to come to you. The same line of questioning on where do we go from here? How do we give Palestinians hope? How do we get out of this endless cycle of despair? We hear a lot of condemnations from the Europeans, from others in the international community, but really not much else. What role should the broader international community be playing to prevent things, the current escalation from really spiraling out of control?
You know, listening to my colleagues and the different points that have been across, I was thinking about, you know, how ANERA was started right after the '67 war and the occupation of Palestine. And we mentioned this before, 30 years ago, we had this hope of ending the occupation, working towards peace, working towards a two-state solution, working to look to see real hope. Again, this word that's been coming up over and over again, looking to see real hope for the Palestinians and how we move forward. Not much has happened. We've had over 16 years of the blockade in Gaza. We see the situation keep getting better. I think it's so simple and basic in terms of what the international community can do. And it's something that we've been talking about for the last so many decades, you know, since 1967, an end to the occupation. I think that's first and foremost. The international community needs to really look at taking steps to end the occupation. Going back to the Oslo Accords, what were in those Oslo Accords to work towards that ending of occupation? And we look at, you know, the increasing settlements and the escalation in violence and how this is all affecting Palestinians. That's not something that has been held, the Oslo Accords have been held true by both sides. And we need to go back to see what we want to do. Does the international community still see a viable two-state solution? Is that something that's in the air, or do we want to look at something different? And Brian, you mentioned this, how can we move forward in that? So I believe that, you know, when we look at these things, fundamentally those basic issues, and again, holding Israel to account for the level of violence, the type of violence, acting with impunity, that leads all these things that Palestinians feel that they are out of sight and out of mind. And when we talk about the international community, there's always things happening around the world. We look at the situation in Ukraine right now and the war that's happening there. So again, the focus is somewhere else. And when that happens, because we are out of sight, escalations tend to increase in Palestine. The violence tends to increase. The amount of killings that have happened from January to September of this year has almost, I believe, 40% more than the same time as the period last year. So we need to look at, as an international community, and what we can do, what do we want in the region, and how we can reach there. And I think what we need to say is that international community, led by the brokers of the Oslo Accord, need to look at ending the occupation, ending the blockade, and allowing for economic development for Palestinians.
ending the occupation is a very simple task.
Yeah,
To be able to do
I mean,
that.
we've only been working on it for.
Wave that wand, that
Brian,
deoccupation.
Tell us how we're going to end the occupation.
Yeah.
So coming to you, Brian, on this same
Sure.
line of where we go from here, and if since we're here in Washington, if you could focus a little bit on the U.S. role. Recently, we heard Ambassador Tom Nides, the American ambassador to Israel, warn in very sharp terms that the West Bank was on the verge of an explosion. That was really quite a statement coming from an administration that has mostly tried to downplay this issue, tried to put it up on a shelf, to take a real hands-off approach. Do you think that this administration is maybe turning a corner in how it's viewing this issue? Is it going to become a greater priority? Maybe it will engage more. What do you think the U.S. can and should be doing going forward?
So to answer your question of will they get more engaged? Simple answer is no. Should they? Yes. The ambassador's statement, I think, is just a recognition of reality. We've been talking for the last hour about the terrible dynamics. In my years in think tanks here in DC, I've become quite adept at identifying the gap between statements that are made and what's actually being done in terms of policy.
But that almost never happens.
No. And if you know the phrase in Arabic, hakifadi, if we could capture the hakifadi on the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue, somehow I actually think the climate discussion we're going to have here later on this afternoon at MEI, we could maybe eliminate some of the global warming trends there. But it's a serious issue in terms of the gap between statements of concern and then nothing that's followed up. And the basic issue here with U.S. policy, and again, I mean no disrespect, because there are people working really hard in this administration who had worked in think tanks before and really tried to think through these issues. They get in there and they see a constraint, mostly within the administration, self-imposed. There were other priorities, clearly Russia, Ukraine, China, but by definition of their own strategy, the Biden national security strategy, the broader Middle East was not a big concern. It took a long time for President Biden and his team to decide whether he would even go and visit the Middle East. It was still up in the air. So that's one question. But the structural dynamic that you identified, now I want to do a plug for Khalid's great book, Blind Spot, 2019, published by some institute called the Brookings Institute a block away. You talked about this dynamic where U.S. Palestine policy was always just a subsidiary or underneath the U.S.-Israel framework. We're still there, by and large, despite efforts under Trump, which I classified as a maximum pressure campaign on the Palestinians. Everybody knows about the maximum pressure on Iran and how that did not yield the results that were hoped for. There was a genuine effort, I think, in the first year of Trump to talk to Palestinian officials. I remember meeting with them after that, and they're like, he loves us and it's going to be great. And then right after that, there was a serious effort, 2018, cutting off all sorts of funding to help Palestinian people, try to isolate them politically. There was a nonsensical effort to have, there were literally, you remember this, conferences on Gaza that didn't include Gazans or Palestinians. There were conferences on the Palestinian economy that more or less did not include meaningful representation from the Palestinians. So there's a maximum pressure isolation campaign under Trump. Biden's tried to correct for that slightly, right? You look at the visit that he made in July, and there was a question of whether he would even do the visit. But when they, on the Palestinian component of that visit, in advance, they wanted to and did set a very low bar of expectations. They set the bar very, very low. Here we are 3 months after the visit. I would say that they have not even cleared the bar of their low expectations of what they would deliver. They were, trying to do things like get funding to the hospitals in East Jerusalem. My understanding is that those promises and pledges have not been fully realized yet. A lot of work to do, and it's complicated. But back to your question, what would you do? So I don't have high hopes that they'll prioritize this. I think they should, if they're interested in a broader, more stable Middle East. I would try to be briefer here and say, think of this as 3 legs in a stool. Number one is the politics on the Palestinian side. We have all said this on this panel, and it's easier said than done to think about how to get from here to there, because the simple modalities of holding an election that gives voice to all Palestinians, the 2 million in Gaza, 3 million in West Bank, nearly 1 million in East Jerusalem, which is in its own difficult situation, which I hope we talk about. That's easier said than done, but I think essential to do. And I fear that US policy right now on Palestine, it sounds a little like 2010, 2011 policy on the Middle East, that they know that there's some embers out there that could flare up that became Tunisia, Egypt, and all of it, but they really don't want to think about it. It's sort of, we don't talk about Bruno of US foreign policy. We don't talk about Palestine. But the politics is the one leg of the stool, and Palestinians, this is the frustrating Rubik's Cube of it, is they've got to do things differently than what their leadership is. But again, US engagement and elevating US to Palestine engagement, like your book argued, is essential in doing that, dedicate more resources. Second is the security. We talked about the security, and yes, we can throw all sorts of terms around, and the occupation is real and it's having an impact, but trying to rebuild trust between the different parties on security and trust and confidence, Palestinian people to their own security institutions, Palestinian to Israeli cooperation, and doing it in a way that actually helps restore a sense of law and order. Why that's important for so many reasons, for reasons we've talked about, but it's important for the first reason as well, is that for politics to take place in an environment where there's a meltdown in the security environment, it just won't work, right? And that's, again, requires US deeper engagement. We have a security assistance team that does, fine, good work for 17 years, I think, 18 years. I joked with you recently that if it were your kid, you'd be kicking him out of your basement soon. And it should have been graduated because the idea was to have a Palestinian state. And then lastly, and I'll close here, and Omar and others talked about it, is the regional dynamic. We at MEI in New York hosted recently a forum with several foreign ministers from the region. I was in a meeting yesterday with another foreign minister. There is this thing called the Negev process. The Palestinians are not part of it. Jordan's not part of it right now as well. It has brought some of the so-called Abraham Accord countries together with Israel. Egypt has been part of it. They just necessarily at some point have to be part of that if it's going to be a real thing, if it's going to have deep roots and things like that. Or you heard recent echoes of, remember the 20-year-old now Arab Peace Initiative from the Saudis? They've dusted that off the shelf, right? But the key point, again, is that none of these regional accords can be constructed like a settlement road in the West Bank that goes around the Palestinians. It needs to actually include them. The three legs of these stools are interlinked, right? Without different type of politics and voices that are from the Palestinian leadership that are connected and making it more of an issue, without security. And that's the conundrum in all of this. That's why it's so easy to just say, okay, end the occupation. And would that be so? I'd love for that, but its bigger point is that it requires a level of effort from the US administration that I would not bet a lot of money that it should do, but if they don't, is my warning, they're going to be caught in a reactive crisis management tactical mode in the way that they were during the Arab Spring, or where I think they're scrambling right now on Iran a bit, trying to figure out a plan B-ish related to the protests and the nuclear deal not going on. So I think an ounce of prevention and more engagement directly with the Palestinians would go a long way to try to, again, it won't solve all these things, but I think it's an essential piece in the equation.
Just a real quick follow-up on that. Do you think that a renewal of Palestinian politics, were it to happen, would lead, sort of in keeping with the comparison with the Arab Spring, would that then trigger a different sort of engagement from the Biden administration or whichever successor administration?
Yeah, recognizing that we're in the big realm of hypothetical
Right.
and the dream, that there would be a renewal. I think it could, and I hope we would learn the lessons from the mistakes made in the 2006 episode and everything there. But the interesting thing, and others have talked about this, and I think we talked about no hope, and it's true. But the thing that I did find slightly hopeful, and I think Palestinians look at actuarial tables, they see sort of changes coming at some point. And there's some hope that there are people who are doing things quietly that are organizing agendas and ideas. So, and this is often not portrayed back here in the US because it's always about the security incidents and it's awful and sort of the images of the militants, right? And they're there. I'm not denying that they're part of the scene. But what I think the consensus is we want to have normal politics that are peaceful, that lobby for our own voice. And that's an interesting thing. And I think that could happen. And the last thing I'd say is if you look at the recent polls, a couple of them in summer, and then one that just came out earlier this month of Palestinian opinion and who they'd vote for, there's a huge gaping hole between Fatah and Hamas, and then even some of the old DFLP, PFLP. There's just a hankering, especially amongst the next generation, for a new way. And if you don't sort of reset the politics in some sort of way, and if you try to have some sort of stage managed, oh, we're just going to control some triumvirate or something that's going to keep the reins of this authority that already has diminishing political legitimacy, it won't work, right? And a better pathway, though harder, is to get to a new election as quickly as possible that gives voice to those people. And yes, depending on who emerges, there may be, again, more opportunity for not only the US, but other outsiders, regional actors, to engage with those new faces that need to emerge.
Right, thank you. So it really, I mean, to sort of sum up, I think what there seems to be a consensus is in order to change things, change really begins at home. That Palestinians have to first kind of address their own issues before they can effectively engage with the region, with the international community, with the United States, and so forth. And it's a very interesting conclusion, and one that I don't think is not necessarily intuitive, right? Anyway, I think we are pretty much out of time. So thank you all for a tremendously engaging and fascinating discussion. Thank you, Brian, Sandra, Suhair, and Omar. Thank you for joining us virtually. And thank you all for participating. And we hope to see you at our next Palestine program event in the not too distant future.